Horror is one of the most fluctuating genres within the video game industry. In the 90s we saw quite a few of them before they practically died off in the early 2000s. It wasn't until the release of Amnesia: The Dark Descent in 2010 that the genre received a rebirth, with titles of varying quality. From Outlast to Five Nights at Freddy's to Overcast, Walden and the Werewolf. Nearly every day there was some form of new horror title appearing. But in recent years, the genre has once again declined, with only the occasional horror game making an appearance. So when one does come along, I can't help but check it out. Horns of Fear is a psychological horror game developed and published by indie developer Pixuala. It released on Steam June 7th, 2018. Horns of Fear offers a classic horror experience, taking clear influence from such classics as Resident Evil and Silent Hill. It has great atmosphere, decent puzzles and some very good horror scenarios. But it has poorly written dialogue resulting in characters with no unique voice, a cliche ending that ruins the overall intrigue and experience, along with questionable late game design choices. You take on the role of journalist Jim Sunramore, who has been down on his luck as of late. He sits at his desk and talks about how his wife recently moved out, taking their daughter with her, and that he sits alone in his house taking pills, eating pizza, watching Seinfeld and talking to his imaginary friend. I did say the dialogue was poorly written. After taking his pill, he presumably falls asleep and is woken up by the sound of his phone vibrating beside him. Upon answering the call, a woman asks if he wants to investigate the paranormal activity at a mansion that he had recently written an article on. He agrees and makes his way to the address. Upon arriving and knocking on the door, nobody answers, but the door is open. He enters and begins his investigation as to what kind of paranormal activity is going on in the house and what the owners have to say about it, while trying to avoid dying by the hands of a monster called the Caretaker. For starters, the characters of the game are boring. They are all very similar in many regards and are lacking unique voices in their writing. If it wasn't for the fact that each character has their own portraits and sounds when dialogue appears, you would be hard pressed to tell the difference between them. A good example of this is when you speak to the daughter of the mansion owners. While she does in one instance use some typical modern teenage text language, the rest of her dialogue is very grown up. It feels like you're talking to an adult as opposed to a somewhat withdrawn teenager that the character is designed to be. It is a shame, as each character has their own place in the world, and if they had a unique voice it would have made them far more interesting. Then there is the ending to the game. I'm going to warn you, I do need to spoil this to give my assessments, so if you don't want to know the ending, please do skip forward. Near the end of the game, everything is pretty much turned upside down. It is revealed that everything in the mansion is nothing more than a hallucination caused by the drug Jim takes at the beginning of the game. The whole story about the mansion is nothing more than mythology or a local legend. In reality, after taking the drug, he went to where his wife and daughter were staying, entered, and ended up killing them due to the drug called the Minotaur drug, making those who take it extremely aggressive. Usually I like twists in stories, but when it comes to Horns of Fear, the plot was actually more interesting, with the mansion and the mystery being real. I have a particular distaste for stories that use the whole "it wasn't real" or "it was just a dream" twist at the end. It isn't good nor clever writing. Everything about the game, right to its store page, speaks about a mansion where the paranormal is occurring. It is the identity that the developer gave the game, and it is how it should have been kept, as opposed to giving it one of the most overused and cliche endings in writing. It is the mansion that makes the game interesting and actually keeps you playing from start to finish. To have all that end up being just a hallucination just ends up with disappointment, and it is such a shame, as up until then it was intriguing. The way the ending to the game is designed, it does leave some questions unanswered, such as the monstrous caretaker. His existence is left to the player's own interpretation, as in the big reveal there is nothing mentioned about him when talking about the hallucinations, yet he continues to haunt Jim afterwards. My theory is that the caretaker is Jim's imaginary friend. The reason for this is at the start of the game, Jim, while talking to his friend, talks about how he always wanted to be an artist as opposed to a journalist. He talks about wanting to paint creatures all day long. Creatures possibly being demons. If you look closely above Jim's desk, there is actually a crude painting of the caretaker. I believe that the Minotaur drug simply turned Jim's own creation and its story into a living entity, hence why it is still with him even at the end of the game. Overall, the plot is initially intriguing as you begin to uncover the mystery and the story behind the mansion, despite its dialogue problems. But sadly, all that is ruined by the cliche ending, resulting in nothing but disappointment. The majority of the gameplay for Horns of Fear revolves around exploring the mansion and needing to solve the numerous puzzles found throughout in order to progress. You move from room to room, inspecting the many things that each contains, such as paintings, books, statues, and so on, along with interacting with a handful of characters you meet. It is pretty old school exploration with a classic Resident Evil and Alone in the Dark feel to it, but from a more 2D perspective as opposed to full on 3D like they were. It doesn't reinvent the wheel, but it works well with movement at a reasonable pace, brief but effective descriptions of items, and not too lengthy exposition. There are a few instances in the game where you are put in a life or death situation involving the monstrous caretaker. These moments involve QTE sequences where you need to press the correct key or you will die instantly. While QTEs and the words die instantly generally are enough to put someone off of a game, the developer has been pretty merciful with them here. Usually in games, if you die during a QTE sequence, you will need to start over from your previous save game or checkpoint, but here you only need to start over from the beginning of the sequence. So it isn't too much of a big deal if you do die, but you will lose out on the perfect achievement where you can't die at all throughout the game. They're as enjoyable as QTE sequences can get, and they do add a much needed level of intensity to the game. The problem is they only occur about twice, maybe a third time throughout the whole game, and most of them are within the first 20 minutes. With that said, however, they do keep you on edge, which is exactly what you're looking for in a horror game. In Horns of Fear, instead of saving your game using a typewriter or notepad, as found in Silent Hill or Resident Evil, you instead need to use one of the various computers scattered throughout the mansion and its grounds. There are plenty of them throughout the game, generally never being any more than 4 or 5 screens apart from each other, this resulting in there always being a save point nearby if you ever need to take a break or do something. The puzzles of the game generally revolve around having to figure out a combination or activating a sequence using a series of buttons on a specific mechanism. The answers to the puzzles are always scattered throughout the area you are in, which are generally written in a book or note. Sometimes the puzzle will even show you where the clues to its answer are located. They're all relatively creative, yet don't present anything you wouldn't have already seen in something like The Seventh Guest, and are pretty easy to figure out. There was never a point in the game where I can say I was stumped when attempting to figure out the answer to a puzzle. While their difficulty may be too little for more experienced puzzle players, it does allow for pretty much anyone to play the game without having to deal with attempting to find taxing solutions to progress, and they are enjoyable to solve. Near the end of the game there are also 2 combat sequences where you need to face off against the caretaker. The first is where you fight him using a shovel. This is pretty much a case of dodge his attack and then hit him and repeat. Having this combat sequence does break up the gameplay, but it feels very out of place considering the rest of the game has consisted of purely exploration, puzzle solving and avoiding the caretaker. You are unprepared for it as it just throws you straight into it out of nowhere. It leaves you vulnerable and not really sure how to tackle the situation, and I would have rather avoided the whole situation entirely. Then right at the end of the game you need to face the caretaker once again, this time from a first person perspective in the gameplay style of an arcade shooter, except you use a mouse as opposed to a handheld gun. And even with a fast paced shooting gameplay like this, you still need to solve one last puzzle before being able to beat the boss. I'll admit it was pretty cool and fun going head to head against the caretaker, blasting him in the face after he tormented me throughout the game. But just like the first combat sequence, it feels so out of place for the style of game Horns of Fear is presented as. It would be like playing Amnesia: The Dark Descent and at the very end you have to face off against Alexander in combat. It wouldn't work in Amnesia, and it really doesn't work here. Along with the combat sequences, the game starts pulling off Pony Island like glitches, where it makes the whole world of Horns of Fear out to be a video game. That worked in Pony Island because it was being self-aware of this. You were a lost soul trapped in an arcade video game created by the devil. It worked with Pony Island because that is exactly what it was. It identified itself as a video game within a video game. But here it doesn't do that. It just feels like it was put in because the developer thought it was cool when they did it with Pony Island. It just ends up being cringeworthy. Finally are the horror sequences of the game. These tend to be one of 2 ways throughout the game. The first is where there is genuinely clever and atmospheric build up, while the second is cheap jump scares. From time to time you get sequences that get very psychological and have some visual moments that would even give Silent Hill a run for its money. Then you get those moments where something will make a loud noise or a shadow will run by a window with a typical rip of the violin and things like that. It is the best and worst kind of horror put into one. There were times in the game where I was quite on edge and finding myself being cautious, and then others where I just let off exasperated sighs as the game tried to scare me, desperately failing. When the horror sequences are good, they are really good, but when bad, they are bloody terrible. But while that may be the case, it is the type of horror that pretty much everyone can get something out of. If you like jump scares, this game has it. If you like scares that have great atmospheric build-up and begin to make you question reality from fiction, the game has it. It is one of those situations where for everyone it is going to have some moments of ups and downs when it comes to the horror, but overall there is more than enough to make it enjoyable. The gameplay as a whole in Horns of Fear is a bit of a convoluted mess. It is a game that doesn't really know what it wants to be. One minute it is trying to be a 2D Amnesia the Dark Descent, the next it is going Silent Hill before it starts shitting out some Pony Island tricks without understanding what made that game actually work. Horns of Fear is at its best when it is being itself, but once it starts throwing in all these inspirations and influences from other games, it begins to lose itself. Thankfully, this loss of self only happens in the last 10 or 15 minutes of the game, and up until that point it does a good job of keeping on track with what it initially set out to be, that being a classic horror game with puzzle solving. If it had just stayed at that, it would have been a far better experience, as opposed to trying to jam everything that made other games cool in at the most important part of any game, the end. But with that said, it does just about enough to not make it a bad gameplay experience, but it certainly isn't an exceptional one. If there is one thing that Horns of Fear does very well, it is the atmosphere. Throughout the entire game, no matter the circumstance, the ambience and the soundtrack always delivers. When exploring the mansion, it has a slow, eerie ambience track, something similar to that of the original Resident Evil game. It really makes you feel alone, yet there is always something watching you, and it really helps to keep you on edge, anticipating when you're next going to be jumped by the caretaker. And then when he does appear, the quiet ambience turns into one of urgency. It works really well throughout, and there was never a point in the game where I felt the atmosphere go astray from that of what the game was presenting. Horns of Fear is a lot like a B-movie horror. Its plot is poorly written, the dialogue is awful, and the directing and design is questionable, ending up somewhat convoluted. They are generally a case of being so bad that they are good, and that is what Horns of Fear is. It is a bad game in many regards, but at the same time it is oddly still enjoyable for the most part. Its gameplay is all over the place near the end of the game, but for the majority of it, it brings a classic exploration and puzzle solving gameplay experience similar to that of Amnesia, but from a 2D perspective. The horror sequences have their ups and downs between clever design and outright jump scares, but offer up enough of both to make it enjoyable for all. The puzzles are clever enough and offering a challenge while not being too taxing for those wanting more of a horror experience over a puzzle one. And while poorly written and has an off-putting ending, the plot does keep you playing up until the last 10 or 15 minutes where everything goes to shit. Horns of Fear is one of those games that are a reviewer's worst nightmare. It is such a rollercoaster ride of positives and negatives, it is hard to figure out from a professional standpoint whether it is a good or bad game. But after much deliberation, I finally came to the conclusion that there is enough to enjoy of the game to consider it okay. And with that, I give Horns of Fear a 6 out of 10. At a price of $5, I have certainly played far worse games costing more. It isn't an exceptional game by any stretch of the imagination, but if you play it with the same low expectations as you would watching a low budget B-movie horror, then you may just get enough to have an alright time with it.